Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her helmet one final time as she walked across the concrete toward her Apache helicopter. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base in Afghanistan, and the familiar weight of her flight gear felt reassuring after 3 months of missions. At 28, she was one of the youngest female Apache pilots in the squadron, but her record spoke louder than her age. 47 successful combat missions without a single casualty on her watch. The briefing room had been tense that morning. Intelligence reports suggested increased enemy activity in the valley they were assigned to patrol. But Sarah had flown over that terrain dozens of times. She knew every ridge, every possible hiding spot, every safe landing zone. Her co-pilot and gunner, Lieutenant Jake Torres, was already running through the pre-flight checklist when she climbed into the cockpit. "Everything looks good up here, Captain," Jake said through the intercom. His voice carried the easy confidence of someone who had complete trust in his pilot. They had been flying together for 6 months, and their partnership had become legendary in the squadron. Sarah's precise flying, combined with Jake's expert gunnery, had saved countless ground troops during dangerous extraction missions. Sarah settled into her seat and began her own checks. The Apache AH-64 was a magnificent machine, bristling with weapons and advanced electronics. Every switch, every gauge, every warning light had a purpose, and Sarah knew them all by heart. The twin engines hummed to life with their characteristic whine, and the massive rotor blades began their slow rotation overhead. "Tower, this is Apache 77. Requesting clearance for Patrol Mission Bravo 4, Sarah spoke into her radio. The response came back immediately, crisp and professional. Weather conditions were good, visibility excellent, and no other aircraft were operating in their assigned sector. As they lifted off, Sarah felt the familiar surge of excitement that came with every flight. Below them, the base grew smaller, and ahead lay the rugged mountains of eastern Afghanistan. The landscape was both beautiful and deadly, filled with hidden caves and narrow valleys, where enemies could disappear like ghosts. Their mission was routine patrol and close air support for a convoy of supply trucks making their way through the dangerous mountain passes. The convoy commander, Sergeant Rodriguez, had specifically requested air cover after recent attacks on similar missions. Sarah had worked with Rodriguez before and respected his tactical knowledge and concern for his men. 20 minutes into the flight, they reached their patrol area. The convoy was right on schedule, a line of armored vehicles winding through the valley below like mechanical ants following a predetermined path. Sarah established radio contact with the convoy leader and began her systematic surveillance of the surrounding terrain. The radio chatter was normal at first. Convoy reports, weather updates, and routine position checks filled the airwaves, but something felt different to Sarah. She had developed an instinct over her months of combat flying, a sixth sense that warned her when situations were about to turn dangerous. Today, that instinct was screaming. "Jake, you notice anything odd about today's mission briefing?" she asked her gunner while keeping her eyes on the terrain below. "Now that you mention it, Captain, the intelligence seemed pretty vague. Usually we get more specific threat assessments." Jake was scanning through his thermal imaging system, looking for any signs of enemy movement. Sarah nodded. The briefing had been unusually short, and the intelligence officer had seemed nervous, avoiding direct eye contact with the flight crews. But she had dismissed it at the time, focusing instead on the technical aspects of the mission. The first sign of trouble came from an unexpected source. A flight of F-16 fighters that should have been operating 50 miles to the south suddenly appeared on their radar, heading directly toward their position. Sarah tried to raise them on the radio but got no response. "This is Apache 77 calling Falcon Flight. Please respond," she transmitted. Static filled her headphones. Minutes later, the convoy below began taking small arms fire from the ridgeline to the east. This was expected and part of their mission profile. Sarah moved the Apache into position to provide suppressive fire while Jake identified targets through his advanced optics. But then something happened that would change everything. As Sarah maneuvered for her attack run, a new voice came over the radio. It was Colonel Marcus Webb, the base commander, speaking directly to her. "Apache 77, this is base command. You are ordered to break off your current mission and return to base immediately." Sarah was confused. The convoy was under fire and needed her support. "Base command, we have friendlies taking fire. Request permission to complete support mission." "Negative, Apache 77. Return to base immediately. This is a direct order. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving Sarah staring at her radio in disbelief. In all her months of flying, she had never been ordered to abandon troops under fire. Something was seriously wrong. Jake had heard the exchange and was equally puzzled. "Captain, what do we do? The convoy needs us." Before Sarah could respond, her radio crackled again. This time it was Sergeant Rodriguez from the convoy, his voice tight with stress. "Apache 77, we're taking heavy fire from multiple positions. We need immediate air support or we're not going to make it out of this valley." Sarah found herself caught between conflicting orders and the reality of soldiers in danger below her. Her training said to follow orders from base command, but her conscience said to protect the men who were counting on her. She made her decision. "Jake, we're staying. Those men need us more than base command needs us back for whatever bureaucratic issue they're dealing with." As she spoke those words, Sarah had no idea that her radio transmission was being recorded, or that powerful people back at the base were watching her every move through satellite feeds. She had no way of knowing that her decision to stay and fight would set in motion a chain of events that would threaten not only her career, but her life. The Apache banked sharply as Sarah moved into position for her first attack run, unaware that she was flying directly into a trap that had been months in the making. The attack run went perfectly. Sarah's rockets found their targets along the ridgeline, silencing several enemy positions that had been pinning down the convoy. Jake's precision with the 30mm cannon cleared additional threats, and within minutes the convoy was able to move to safer ground. The grateful voices of the ground troops filled the radio, as they reported casualties were minimal thanks to the Apache's intervention. But Sarah's relief was short-lived. As they climbed away from the valley, her radio erupted with angry transmissions from base command. "Apache 77, you have directly disobeyed orders. Return to base immediately for disciplinary action." This time the voice belonged to Major Harrison, the squadron's executive officer. Sarah had always found him to be ambitious and political, more concerned with his career advancement than with the welfare of pilots under his command. His tone now carried a barely concealed fury that seemed disproportionate to the situation. "Roger, base command. Apache 77 returning to base," Sarah replied, keeping her voice professional despite her growing unease. During the 20-minute flight back, Jake tried to lighten the mood with jokes about military bureaucracy, but Sarah remained quiet. Something about this entire situation felt orchestrated, as if she had been deliberately placed in a position where she would have to choose between following orders and saving lives. The landing at the base was routine, but as soon as the rotor blades stopped turning, Sarah saw military police waiting near the helicopter. This was definitely not standard procedure for a simple disciplinary matter. Colonel Webb approached her as she climbed down from the cockpit. His expression was grim and he avoided making direct eye contact. "Captain Mitchell, you're to report for immediate debriefing. Your aircraft is grounded pending investigation." "Investigation of what, sir?" Sarah asked, genuinely confused. "Unauthorized engagement of enemy forces and disobedience of direct orders," Webb replied, then turned and walked away without further explanation. The debriefing room was crowded with people Sarah didn't recognize. Besides the usual squadron officers, there were men in civilian clothes who introduced themselves vaguely as intelligence specialists. They questioned her for 3 hours about every detail of the mission, paying particular attention to her decision to engage the enemy despite orders to return to base. One of the civilians, a thin man with cold eyes who gave his name only as Mr. Carter, seemed especially interested in her radio communications. "Captain Mitchell, did you discuss this mission with anyone before takeoff? Any conversations that might have indicated you planned to disobey orders?" "No, sir. The mission proceeded exactly as briefed until we received the unexpected recall order," Sarah answered truthfully. But Carter's questions kept returning to the same themes. Had she been in contact with journalists? Had she discussed classified operations with unauthorized personnel? Had she ever expressed disagreement with military policies? Sarah began to realize that this wasn't just about one mission. Someone was building a case against her, looking for evidence of deeper misconduct. But why? The answer began to emerge over the following days. Sarah was confined to quarters pending the completion of the investigation, which gave her time to think and piece together recent events. She remembered now that Major Harrison had seemed particularly interested in her mission assignments lately. always asking detailed questions about her flight plans and objectives. She also recalled a conversation from 2 weeks earlier with Captain Lisa Park, a fellow pilot who had been mysteriously transferred to another base immediately after questioning Harrison's handling of a dangerous mission. Lisa had mentioned concerns about supply contracts and unusual cargo manifests, but Sarah hadn't paid much attention at the time. Now, confined to her quarters with nothing but time to think, Sarah began to see a pattern. The convoy she had protected had been carrying more than just routine supplies. According to the mission briefing, they were transporting medical equipment and food to a forward operating base, but she remembered seeing some unusual containers that didn't match that description. Her roommate, Lieutenant Amy Chen, was one of the few people allowed to visit her. During one of these visits, Amy brought disturbing news. "Sarah, there are rumors going around that you're being investigated for selling mission information to insurgents," Amy whispered, glancing around nervously. "That's ridiculous," Sarah replied. "Where are these rumors coming from?" "Major Harrison has been talking to people, asking if anyone noticed you acting strangely or having unexplained money. He's also been going through your personal effects." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Someone was systematically destroying her reputation and building a case for treason. But why would they go to such elaborate lengths just to get rid of one Apache pilot? The answer came from an unexpected source. Jake Torres, her gunner, managed to visit her by claiming he needed to discuss technical details about their shared aircraft. During their brief conversation, he revealed something that changed everything. "Captain, I've been thinking about that convoy we protected. I've flown security for supply runs before, and something was different about this one. The containers were marked with codes I'd never seen, and there were way too many armed escorts for a routine medical supply delivery." Jake paused and looked around nervously before continuing. "I think we accidentally protected something we weren't supposed to protect. And I think Major Harrison was counting on us following orders and leaving that convoy to be destroyed." Sarah stared at her gunner as the implications sank in. If Jake was right, then the recall order hadn't been about military discipline at all. It had been about allowing the convoy to be attacked and destroyed, eliminating evidence of whatever those unusual containers contained. By protecting the convoy, she had unknowingly foiled someone's plan to cover up illegal activities. Now they needed to discredit her before she could figure out what was really going on. That night, alone in her quarters, Sarah made a decision that would determine whether she lived or died. She began documenting everything she could remember about recent missions, paying special attention to cargo manifests, personnel assignments, and unusual orders. She also started looking for a way to communicate with the outside world. If powerful people within her own command structure were trying to destroy her, she would need allies outside the military hierarchy. But Sarah had no idea how high up the conspiracy reached, or how far her enemies would go to silence her permanently. As she worked by the dim light of her desk lamp, copying down serial numbers and dates from memory, she was being watched through surveillance cameras she didn't know existed. Her every move was being reported to people who had already decided that Captain Sarah Mitchell knew too much to be allowed to live. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Chief Warrant Officer Tom Bradley, the base's senior maintenance supervisor, had worked on military helicopters for 23 years. He had seen pilots come and go, and he prided himself on being able to read people. Sarah Mitchell was one of the most honest and competent pilots he had ever worked with, and the charges against her didn't make sense. Bradley had his own reasons for being suspicious of Major Harrison. Over the past few months, Harrison had been issuing unusual maintenance orders, requiring specific modifications to certain helicopters that didn't appear in any official technical manuals. When Bradley had questioned these orders, Harrison had threatened to have him transferred to a less desirable posting. 3 days after Sarah's confinement began, Bradley made a decision that would save her life. Using his security clearance and maintenance access, he began investigating the helicopters that had been modified under Harrison's orders. What he found confirmed his worst suspicions. Hidden among the routine maintenance logs were records of special equipment installations. Navigation systems had been modified with remote override capabilities. Communication systems had been fitted with secondary channels that could be activated without the pilot's knowledge. Most disturbing of all, some aircraft had been equipped with devices that could simulate mechanical failures and force emergency landings. Bradley realized that someone had been systematically preparing to eliminate pilots who became inconvenient. Sarah's Apache was next on the modification list. The old warrant officer faced a terrible dilemma. If he reported his findings through normal channels, the evidence would disappear, and he would likely share Sarah's fate. But if he remained silent, an innocent pilot would be murdered. Bradley chose to act. Using his personal laptop and an internet connection at a coffee shop in the nearby town, he sent an encrypted email to a journalist friend who specialized in military corruption stories. The email contained photographs of the modified equipment and copies of the suspicious maintenance orders. Meanwhile, Sarah's situation was deteriorating rapidly. The investigation had expanded to include allegations of financial impropriety, with claims that she had received unexplained payments from foreign sources. Bank records that Sarah had never seen were presented as evidence of her guilt. During one particularly harsh interrogation session, Mr. Carter, the cold-eyed civilian, laid out the case against her in detail. According to the official story, Sarah had been recruited by insurgent forces months earlier. She had been providing them with flight schedules, cargo manifests, and tactical information. The decision to protect the convoy despite orders had been part of a plan to preserve insurgent supplies that were hidden among the legitimate cargo. "Captain Mitchell," Carter said with a thin smile, "we have bank records showing payments to your account from a Pakistani intermediary. We have testimony from other pilots that you asked suspicious questions about mission details, and we have your own radio transmissions proving that you deliberately disobeyed orders." Sarah listened in shock as the fabricated case was presented. Every piece of evidence had been carefully constructed to appear legitimate. Someone had spent months building this frame, anticipating that she would eventually need to be eliminated. "The charges carry a mandatory death sentence," Carter continued. "However, the military is prepared to offer you a deal. If you confess to your crimes and provide information about your insurgent contacts, your sentence could be reduced to life imprisonment." Sarah looked directly into Carter's eyes. "I'm innocent and you know it. I don't know what you're really after, but I won't confess to crimes I didn't commit." Carter's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Captain Mitchell, you have 24 hours to reconsider. After that, this offer will be withdrawn permanently." That evening, Amy Chen brought Sarah a message hidden inside a technical manual. It was from Tom Bradley, warning her that her helicopter was scheduled for emergency maintenance the next morning. The message was brief but clear. They were going to sabotage her aircraft and arrange for a fatal accident during her next flight. Sarah realized she had one chance to survive. She needed to get to her helicopter before the sabotage could be completed and find evidence of the conspiracy. But first, she needed to escape from her closely guarded quarters. The opportunity came during the midnight shift change. Sarah had been observing the guards' routines for days, noting that there was a brief 2-minute window when the old guard left before the new guard arrived. Using sheets tied together, she rappelled from her second-story window and made her way across the base toward the flight line. The helicopter hangar was dimly lit, with only security lighting casting long shadows between the aircraft. Sarah's Apache sat in its designated spot, looking normal from a distance, but as she got closer she could see that the engine compartment covers had been removed. Hidden in the shadows behind another helicopter, she watched as 2 technicians she didn't recognize worked on her aircraft. They were installing something near the fuel lines, connecting wires to what looked like a small electronic device. Sarah's military training included basic demolitions, and she recognized what she was seeing. Someone was installing a remotely triggered incendiary device that would cause her helicopter to explode in flight. It would look like a mechanical failure, just another tragic accident in a dangerous war zone. Using her phone, she managed to take several photographs of the technicians and their work. The evidence was damning, but she needed to find a way to preserve it and get it to someone who could expose the conspiracy. As she watched, one of the technicians made a phone call. Sarah couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw him nod several times before hanging up. The work was apparently complete. Her helicopter had been turned into a flying bomb, set to explode on command. The technicians packed up their tools and left the hangar, apparently satisfied with their work. Sarah waited until she was certain they were gone, then crept closer to her aircraft. The device they had installed was sophisticated, designed to look like standard equipment to any casual observer. But Sarah faced a terrible choice. If she removed the device, her enemies would know she had discovered their plan. They would find another way to kill her, probably much more direct and immediate. But if she left the device in place and somehow survived the planned crash, she would have evidence of attempted murder. As she crouched beside her helicopter in the dark hangar, Sarah made a decision that would determine not only her fate, but the fate of other innocent pilots who might be targeted in the future. She would leave the device in place and find a way to turn the trap back on those who had set it. But first, she needed to survive the most dangerous flight of her life, knowing that at any moment, someone with a radio transmitter could turn her aircraft into a fireball in the sky. The next morning brought what appeared to be unexpected news. Colonel Webb informed Sarah that due to procedural irregularities in her case, she was being released from confinement, pending a full review by higher command. She would be allowed to return to flight status immediately, with a routine patrol mission scheduled for that afternoon. Sarah knew this was the setup. They were giving her just enough rope to hang herself, expecting her to take off in the sabotaged helicopter and conveniently disappear in a ball of flame over the Afghan mountains. But she also knew this might be her only chance to gather the evidence needed to expose the entire conspiracy. During the mission briefing, Major Harrison personally handed her the flight plan. His behavior was almost friendly, a stark contrast to his recent hostility. He even made jokes about the investigation being typical military bureaucracy, and assured her that everything would work itself out. Jake Torres was assigned as her gunner again, which created a moral dilemma for Sarah. She couldn't tell him about the sabotage without putting him in danger, but she also couldn't knowingly take an innocent man to his death. She decided to find a way to abort the mission after takeoff, citing mechanical problems. As they walked to the helicopter, Sarah noticed several people who shouldn't have been on the flight line. Carter, the civilian interrogator, was standing near the control tower with what appeared to be radio equipment. Major Harrison was positioned where he could observe the entire flight line through binoculars. Even Colonel Webb was present, something that never happened for routine patrol missions. The pre-flight inspection took on new meaning as Sarah checked every system. She knew the sabotage device was hidden in the engine compartment, but she also looked for any other surprises that might have been installed. Everything appeared normal, which made the situation even more terrifying. Jake noticed her unusual thoroughness during the inspection. "Captain, you're being extra careful today. Everything okay?" "Just want to make sure we don't have any problems," Sarah replied, which was certainly true. As they strapped in and began the startup sequence, Sarah's mind raced through possible scenarios. The device was almost certainly triggered by radio signal, which meant someone would need line-of-sight communication to activate it. They would probably wait until the helicopter was over mountainous terrain where a crash would be difficult to investigate. The engine started normally, and all systems showed green. Sarah requested takeoff clearance, acutely aware that she might be speaking her last words to the control tower. As they lifted off, she could see Carter speaking into his radio device, but he wasn't activating anything yet. 5 minutes into the flight, as they approached the mountains, Sarah made her decision. She would force the conspiracy into the open by refusing to follow the planned route. "Jake, I'm picking up some unusual radio interference. I'm going to deviate from our flight plan and return to base for a communication check." Before Jake could respond, Sarah's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Major Harrison. "Apache 77, you are ordered to continue with your assigned mission. Do not deviate from the planned route." This confirmed Sarah's suspicions. They needed her to be over the mountains when they triggered the device. But she had no intention of making it easy for them. "Base Command, I'm experiencing navigation system malfunctions. Safety protocols require immediate return to base." The radio exploded with angry transmissions. Harrison was ordering her to continue the mission. Colonel Webb was demanding to know the nature of her mechanical problems. Carter's voice even appeared on the radio, identifying himself as a technical specialist and insisting that her navigation systems were functioning normally. Sarah ignored them all and turned the helicopter back toward the base. She was gambling that they wouldn't trigger the device while she was close to the airfield, where the explosion would be witnessed by too many people and investigated too thoroughly. But her enemies were more desperate than she had anticipated. As the base came into view, Carter's voice came over the radio one final time. "Apache 77, you have been declared a rogue aircraft. You will land immediately or face the consequences." Sarah realized they were going to activate the device anyway. In desperation, she began a rapid descent toward the base, hoping to land before they could complete their sabotage. But as she approached the runway, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Fire trucks and ambulances were already positioned around the landing area. Medical personnel were standing by with stretchers. Someone had pre-positioned emergency response teams expecting a crash. At that moment, Sarah understood the full scope of the conspiracy. This wasn't just about eliminating one inconvenient pilot. This was about creating a public incident that would justify larger changes in military policy and personnel. Her death was meant to be a catalyst for something much bigger. With the runway directly ahead and emergency vehicles waiting below, Sarah made a split-second decision that would either save her life or kill her instantly. Instead of landing, she pulled the helicopter into a steep climb and headed back toward the mountains. If they were going to kill her, she would make sure it happened in a way that raised questions rather than providing convenient answers. Jake was shouting into the intercom, demanding to know what was happening. The radio was filled with increasingly frantic orders to land immediately, and somewhere below, a man with a radio transmitter was deciding whether to turn her helicopter into a fireball over a military base filled with witnesses. As they climbed toward the mountains, Sarah began laughing. It wasn't hysteria or madness. It was the sound of someone who had finally understood the game being played and had decided to change the rules. The laughter echoed through the radio transmission, heard by everyone listening on the base below. It would be the last sound many of them expected to hear from Apache 77. Sarah's laughter filled the radio frequencies for nearly 10 seconds before she regained control of herself. But those 10 seconds would prove to be crucial, because her laughter was being recorded not just by the base communications center, but by a completely unexpected listener. Captain Maria Santos, a military intelligence analyst stationed 200 miles away, had been monitoring radio traffic as part of a larger investigation into irregular activities at Sarah's base. She had been tracking unusual cargo flights, suspicious personnel transfers, and financial irregularities for weeks. When she heard Sarah's transmission, followed by the frantic responses from base command, she knew she was witnessing something significant. Santos immediately began recording all radio traffic from the base and started making phone calls to her contacts in Washington. Within minutes, she had alerted the Department of Defense Inspector General's office that a potential conspiracy was unfolding in real time. Meanwhile, in the Apache helicopter climbing toward the mountains, Jake Torres was demanding answers from his pilot. "Captain Mitchell, what the hell is going on? Why are we ignoring direct orders to land?" Sarah realized she could no longer protect Jake by keeping him in the dark. His life was in as much danger as hers now. "Jake, listen carefully. Our helicopter has been sabotaged. There's an explosive device in the engine compartment that can be triggered by radio signal. They're planning to kill us and make it look like an accident." Jake stared at her through the intercom system, his face visible in the reflection of her visor. "Captain, that's impossible. Who would want to kill us? I think we accidentally protected something we weren't supposed to protect during yesterday's convoy mission. Someone wants to cover up what was in those cargo containers, and we've become inconvenient witnesses." As if to confirm her words, the radio crackled again with Carter's voice. "Apache 77, your aircraft has been reported as stolen military property. You will return to base immediately, or you will be shot down." Jake's expression changed as the reality of their situation sank in. "So what do we do, Captain? We can't stay in the air forever, and we can't land anywhere near the base." Sarah had been thinking about that exact problem. "We're going to do something they won't expect. We're going to find a way to expose this conspiracy before they can kill us." She began climbing toward a specific mountain peak that housed a relay station for military communications. If she could get close enough to the relay station, she might be able to override the jamming that was preventing her from contacting outside authorities. But first, she needed to deal with the immediate threat. Carter and his accomplices would eventually trigger the explosive device, probably when the helicopter was over terrain that would make investigation difficult. She needed to find a way to disarm or disable the device while in flight. "Jake, I need you to do something dangerous. Can you access the engine compartment from inside the aircraft?" Jake thought for a moment. "There's an inspection panel behind your seat. It's not designed for in-flight access, but I might be able to reach it if I unbuckle and crawl back there." "Do it. Look for anything that doesn't belong. Wires that shouldn't be there, electronic devices, anything that looks like it was recently installed. As Jake worked his way toward the inspection panel, Sarah continued climbing toward the communications relay. The radio chatter from the base had become increasingly frantic. Major Harrison was screaming orders, Colonel Webb was demanding status reports, and Carter was making veiled threats about the consequences of continued disobedience. But there was also something new in the radio traffic. A calm, professional voice that Sarah didn't recognize was asking questions about the situation and requesting copies of all communications logs. Someone from outside the base command structure was taking an interest in the unfolding crisis. "Captain, I found it," Jake's voice came through the intercom. "There's a device about the size of a cell phone wired into the fuel line. It looks like it's designed to cause an explosion. Can you disable it?" "I think so, but if I cut the wrong wire, it might trigger immediately." Sarah weighed their options. If Jake successfully disarmed the device, they would have evidence of the conspiracy, but would still be trapped in hostile airspace with limited fuel. If he triggered the device accidentally, they would be dead. But if they left it alone, Carter would eventually activate it anyway. "Do it, Jake. Cut the wires." As Jake worked on the sabotage device, Sarah reached the communications relay station. Using emergency override codes that she had memorized during training, she managed to establish contact with the Department of Defense Command Center in Washington. "DoD Command Center, this is Captain Sarah Mitchell, call sign Apache 77. I am reporting a conspiracy involving multiple officers at Forward Operating Base Curtis in Afghanistan. My aircraft has been sabotaged and attempts are being made to murder me and my gunner to prevent exposure of illegal activities." The response was immediate and professional. "Apache 77, this is Colonel Jennifer Walsh, DoD Inspector General. We have been monitoring your situation. Maintain your current position and await instructions." For the first time in days, Sarah felt a surge of hope, but her relief was short-lived. Jake's voice came through the intercom with urgency. "Captain, I've cut the wires, but there's something else. This device was more sophisticated than I thought. It was also recording our conversations and transmitting our location. They've been tracking us the entire time." Sarah looked at her navigation display and realized the implications. If the device had been transmitting their location, then Carter and his accomplices knew exactly where they were. More importantly, they would know that Sarah had contacted outside authorities. The radio crackled with a new transmission. "Apache 77, this is Major Harrison. You have 60 seconds to return to base, or we will be forced to take military action against you." Sarah knew what that meant. They were going to send other aircraft to shoot her down, claiming she had stolen military property and threatened base security. But she also knew that any attack on her helicopter would now be witnessed and recorded by outside authorities. "Jake, are you strapped in?" "Yes, Captain. What are you planning?" Sarah smiled grimly as she pushed the Apache into a steep dive toward the valley below. "We're going to give them exactly what they want, but not the way they expect it." As the helicopter plummeted toward the rocky terrain below, Sarah began laughing again. But this time, her laughter was being heard not just by the conspirators trying to kill her, but by investigators in Washington who were already preparing arrest warrants based on the evidence she had provided. The trap that had been set for Sarah Mitchell was about to snap shut on the people who had built it. Sarah's dive toward the valley wasn't suicidal desperation. It was a calculated maneuver designed to force her enemies into making a critical mistake. She knew that if they shot her down now, while she was in contact with Washington investigators, the incident would be impossible to cover up. But she was gambling that their desperation would overcome their caution. The steep dive took the Apache below the radar coverage of the base, temporarily breaking the tracking lock that hostile aircraft would need to target her. As she leveled out in the valley, flying barely 50 feet above the rocky terrain, Sarah could hear the radio chatter of F-16 fighters being scrambled to intercept her. "Jake, we need to find a place to land where we can be protected until help arrives," she said through the intercom. "Captain, there's nowhere down here that provides cover from air attack. These valleys are completely exposed." Sarah had been thinking about that problem during their descent. "There is one place. The old Soviet mining complex about 10 miles north of here. It has underground facilities that might provide shelter. The abandoned mining operation had been built during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and later used by various groups as a weapons cache. Sarah had flown reconnaissance missions over the area before and knew it contained a network of tunnels and underground chambers that could protect them from air attack. As they raced toward the mining complex, flying between mountain ridges to avoid detection, Sarah maintained radio contact with Colonel Walsh in Washington. The conversation revealed the scope of the investigation that had been quietly building around her base. Apache 77. We have been tracking irregularities at your base for several weeks, Walsh explained. Large quantities of supplies have been reported as destroyed in enemy action, but satellite imagery shows no evidence of the claimed attacks. We believe someone has been selling military equipment and supplies to insurgent groups, then covering up the theft by filing false reports. Sarah thought about the convoy she had protected and its unusual cargo. Colonel, I think the convoy I was ordered to abandon yesterday was carrying evidence of these thefts. Someone wanted it destroyed to eliminate proof of their activities. That's consistent with our investigation. We've been waiting for sufficient evidence to make arrests, but your situation has forced us to act immediately. As they approached the mining complex, Sarah could see the entrance to the main tunnel system. It was large enough to accommodate the helicopter, but landing inside would be extremely dangerous. The tunnel was barely wider than the Apache's rotor span, and any mistake would result in a fatal crash. Jake, I'm going to attempt to land inside the main tunnel. It's our only chance of avoiding the fighters. Captain, that's impossible. The rotor clearance is less than 3 feet on each side. I know, but it's better than being shot down in the open. Sarah began her approach to the tunnel entrance, using every skill she had developed during 3 years of combat flying. The massive rotor blades swept dangerously close to the rocky walls as she eased the helicopter inside. Inch by inch, she maneuvered deeper into the tunnel until they were completely hidden from outside view. The landing was rough, but successful. As the engines wound down, Sarah and Jake found themselves in an eerie underground world lit only by their aircraft's lights. The tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, carved from solid rock by Soviet engineers decades earlier, but their relief was temporary. The radio crackled with transmissions from the F-16 fighters that had been sent to destroy them. Control, this is Falcon 1. We have lost contact with the target aircraft. No visual or radar contact in the search area. Falcon 1, expand your search pattern. The target must be found and neutralized. Sarah realized that the fighters would eventually locate the mining complex and attempt to destroy it with her inside. She needed to find a way to signal her location to the authorities while remaining hidden from her attackers. The solution came from an unexpected source. Deep in the tunnel system, Jake discovered an old Soviet communication bunker that still contained functional radio equipment. The equipment was outdated but powerful, designed to maintain contact with Moscow during the occupation. Working together, Sarah and Jake managed to activate the radio system and establish contact with multiple authorities simultaneously. Within minutes, they were speaking not only with Colonel Walsh in Washington, but also with NATO command in Europe and even with officials at the Pentagon. The evidence Sarah provided over the Soviet radio system was devastating. She had recorded conversations, photographs of the sabotage device, and detailed knowledge of the irregular cargo shipments. Most importantly, she had a complete list of personnel involved in the conspiracy, from Major Harrison at the local level to defense contractors in the United States. But her enemies weren't finished. As she transmitted evidence to Washington, the F-16 fighters had located the mining complex and were preparing to attack. The flight leader's voice came over the radio with chilling clarity. Control, we have located a potential terrorist stronghold at coordinates 374251. Request permission to engage with bunker-busting ordnance. Sarah knew that bunker-busting bombs would collapse the entire tunnel system, killing her and Jake while destroying all evidence of the conspiracy. But she also knew that the attack was being monitored by authorities who now understood what was really happening. Colonel Walsh's voice cut through the radio chatter with unmistakable authority. All aircraft in the vicinity of coordinates 374251, this is DoD command. You are ordered to cease all hostile actions immediately. Any attack on that position will be considered an act of treason against the United States. The radio went silent for several seconds. Then the flight leader responded with obvious confusion. Control, please confirm those orders. We were told this was a terrorist target. Falcon Flight, you are ordered to return to base immediately. Do not engage the target under any circumstances. Sarah heard the F-16 engines fading into the distance as the fighters reluctantly abandoned their attack. But she knew the immediate crisis wasn't over. The conspirators at the base would be trying to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses before investigators could arrive. Colonel Walsh, how long before you can secure the base and arrest the suspects? Apache 77, a team of investigators and military police are already en route. They should arrive within 2 hours. Can you maintain your position until then? Sarah looked around the underground bunker that had become their temporary refuge. The Soviet equipment was still functional. They had enough fuel to restart the helicopter if necessary, and the tunnel system would protect them from any further air attacks. Roger, Colonel. We can hold this position. But as she spoke those words, Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze. Vehicles were approaching the mining complex from outside. Through the tunnel entrance, she could see headlights and hear the sound of multiple trucks. Someone was coming to finish the job that the fighters had been prevented from completing. The sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the tunnel system like thunder. Sarah grabbed her sidearm and motioned for Jake to take cover behind the Apache's landing gear. Through the tunnel entrance, they could see the headlights of at least 3 military vehicles approaching the mining complex. Colonel Walsh, we have hostile forces approaching our position, Sarah transmitted on the Soviet radio system. Multiple vehicles with unknown intentions. Apache 77, maintain your position. Help is closer than you think. Sarah didn't understand what Walsh meant by that cryptic comment, but she prepared for a firefight. The tunnel entrance created a natural choke point that could be defended, but they would be trapped if the attackers brought heavy weapons or explosives. The vehicles stopped just outside the tunnel entrance, and Sarah could hear voices shouting orders. She recognized Major Harrison's voice among them, along with Carter and several other men she didn't know. They were discussing the best way to assault the tunnel and eliminate the witnesses inside. But then something unexpected happened. The sound of helicopters filled the air outside, followed by the distinctive whine of jet engines. Through her radio, Sarah heard a new voice broadcasting on military frequencies. This is Colonel Davis, U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Division. All personnel at the mining complex are ordered to lay down their weapons and surrender immediately. You are surrounded and outgunned. The voices outside the tunnel became confused and angry. Harrison was shouting at someone to continue the attack, while other voices were urging retreat. Sarah realized that the investigators had arrived much faster than anticipated, probably using aircraft from other bases in the region. The standoff lasted for nearly an hour. Harrison and his accomplices were trapped between the tunnel where Sarah was hiding and the overwhelming force of federal investigators who had surrounded the area. Eventually, the sound of gunfire erupted outside as some of the conspirators tried to fight their way out. When the shooting stopped, Colonel Davis's voice came over the radio again. Apache 77, this is Colonel Davis. You are safe to exit the tunnel. All hostile forces have been neutralized or captured. Sarah and Jake emerged from the underground complex to find a scene that looked like a military operation. Federal agents and military police had secured the entire area. Harrison was in handcuffs, along with Carter and 6 other men who had participated in the conspiracy. The evidence that Sarah had provided during her radio transmissions had enabled investigators to move quickly against all aspects of the conspiracy simultaneously. While she had been hiding in the tunnel, teams of agents had been arresting suspects at bases across Afghanistan and even in the United States. Colonel Walsh arrived by helicopter within hours to personally oversee the evidence collection. She explained to Sarah that the conspiracy had been much larger than anyone had initially suspected. Captain Mitchell, what you uncovered was a network of corrupt officers and defense contractors who were stealing millions of dollars worth of military equipment and selling it to insurgent groups. They were using falsified reports of combat losses to cover up the thefts. The investigation revealed that over 30 officers and civilians had been involved in the conspiracy, including several high-ranking officials in the Pentagon. The scheme had been operating for over 2 years, with stolen equipment ending up in the hands of terrorist groups throughout the Middle East. Sarah's decision to protect the convoy had indeed foiled a planned attack that would have destroyed evidence of the thefts. The unusual container she had noticed contained documentation of the illegal sales, financial records, and communication equipment used to coordinate with buyers. Major Harrison had been recruited into the conspiracy months earlier and had been systematically identifying pilots who might become problems. Sarah's reputation for asking questions and following regulations had marked her as a threat that needed to be eliminated. The sophisticated sabotage of her helicopter revealed the extent of their desperation. Rather than risk exposure through a court-martial or transfer, they had decided to murder her and make it appear accidental. But the most shocking revelation came when investigators examined the base's communication logs. Sarah's radio laughter, which had seemed like hysteria at the time, had actually been transmitted during a moment when she realized the full scope of what she was facing. The investigators later determined that her laughter had been a psychological response to understanding that she was not just fighting for her own life, but exposing a conspiracy that threatened the security of every American soldier in the region. The trial of the conspirators lasted for 6 months and resulted in multiple convictions for treason, murder conspiracy, and theft of military property. Harrison received a life sentence while Carter and several others were sentenced to death. Sarah was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions, but she later said that the real heroes were people like Tom Bradley, the maintenance supervisor who had risked his career to expose the sabotage, and Captain Santos, the intelligence analyst who had been tracking the conspiracy for months. The incident led to major reforms in military supply chain oversight and communication protocols. New systems were implemented to prevent the falsification of combat loss reports, and independent oversight was established for all major equipment transfers. Sarah remained in the military for 3 more years before retiring to become a civilian flight instructor. She often spoke at military academies about the importance of moral courage and the dangers of corruption within military institutions. Years later, when asked about the moment when she began laughing over the radio, Sarah would explain that it wasn't madness or hysteria. It was the sound of someone who had suddenly understood that sometimes the most dangerous enemies aren't the ones shooting at you from outside, but the ones wearing the same uniform and sitting at the same briefing tables. Her laughter had echoed across the radio frequencies that day as a warning to anyone listening that truth has a way of surviving even the most elaborate attempts to bury it, and sometimes in the darkest moments, laughter is the only weapon left to fight with. The mining complex where she had hidden was later converted into a memorial for soldiers who had died because of the conspiracy's actions. A plaque at the entrance bore a simple inscription: "Sometimes the greatest courage is found not in following orders, but in knowing when to disobey them."